everyone, and welcome to another Things We Said Today, our weekly roundtable of Beatles happenings and news all over the world, past, present, and future. I'm Steve Marinucci, writer for Billboard.com and Access.com, and let me introduce you to my three cohorts. First up in the, is it snowy there, Alan? In the snowy confines of Maine, our musicologist who was well known for the Beatles desk at the New York Times and now writes for the Wall Street Journal and numerous other publications, and is author of, I don't have my introduction.
Oh, the Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop, and What was it? Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Changed Everything.
Thank you. It's Mr. Alan Posen. Hello, Alan.
Hey, Steve. Hello, everyone.
And coming from Connecticut, the host of the Beatles show Every Little Thing, Mr. Ken Michaels. Hello, Ken.
Hey, Steve. How's it going?
I'm doing well. And coming to us from the great state of Pennsylvania, our legendary Beatles executive editor and the author of He'll Tell Me.
Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped the Generation.
Here we go. Mr. Al Sussman. Hello, Al.
Hi, Steve. Hello there, everybody.
I got to keep it loose. I'm sorry. And joining us this week, we have a very special guest, the author of a recently released book. It's not. I don't think it's not brand new, but a recently released book documenting the history of the Beatles in Canada, and that's the title. Mr. Piers Hemmingsen.
Hemmingsen. Yes.
Hemmingsen. There we go.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, Piers.
All the way from
Piers.
Canada. All the way from Canada. And we got a couple of news things to talk about at the beginning of the show. The biggest thing, and the thing that broke last night as we're taping this on a Monday, is that Ringo posted pictures of him in the studio with Paul McCartney and Joe Walsh. And he's also posted other people in the past few days, but the Paul McCartney pictures really set off a major social media storm and resulted in a story I wrote on Billboard.com this morning. And also, I mean, what do you guys have any comments about this?
Nope.
Yeah, I don't understand why people get excited about Paul and Ringo working together. First of all, they're together all the time. You know, it's not like it's rare that they either appear together or work together. They're together all the time, and so it's not anything rare, and it's not a Beatles reunion because there can't be a Beatles reunion without two others.
Right.
And so I don't understand why people make such a big deal if they see a picture of Paul and Ringo together.
You know, to be honest, I think it's because the two of them together work. I hate to say work better together than separately, but maybe that's not so far afield to say that. I mean, look at. Ken, what do you have to say?
I definitely don't agree with that statement. I mean, they've made great music together, and they've made great music apart.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, because they were both part of the greatest band of all time, anything they do together makes news.
Well, that's very true too.
So in this particular case, Paul showed up because he's adding a bass part to one of Ringo's songs. I don't know if there's any more involvement for Ringo's next album. So you see a photo of the two of them together, and it makes a splash all over social media. And, it's nice to see the two of them together. They are together quite often. They don't work. They don't work together all the time.
No.
This is the first time since Ringo's Why Not album that Paul will be on it. So he's made several albums since then. So it's not like he's on every single album. It's nice to see the two of them together.
And they've done live stuff since that. So, I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's nice, and it reminds us that Ringo has an album coming out due sometime this year, and now we know that Paul will be on it, and when we have tracks to hear, we'll have something to say.
Yeah.
Right.
Pretty much.
And when you look at the list of all the people that apparently are on Ringo's album, there's some of the same people that have been on Ringo's most recent albums.
Uh-huh.
So if you follow what he's been doing and you like the work that he's been doing with these musicians, like Steve Lukather, we heard last year that Richard Marx is supposed to be on it, Peter Frampton's supposed to be on it, those people, then it's going to be probably similar, and maybe there'll be some new additions of people he hasn't worked with. So,
right. He just basically grabs anybody that he can grab and gets them to play with him. So, you kind of never know what's going to come up. But
he's kind of on record of saying that. Basically,
right.
That anybody that comes by the house, pretty much, if they're a musician, they're gonna get a pair of headphones put on them and an instrument put in their hands and participate.
Yeah, but I think it's the excitement of the two of them doing something together.
But there's no excitement because
I disagree.
It's not the Beatles.
I disagree. Look at how quickly
Who cares? Who cares what a bunch of idiots?
A lot of people. Al.
A bunch of idiots on social media.
That photo tweeted like crazy.
Who cares?
Al, you're probably the only one that doesn't. Because a lot of people do, and if Billboard and Rolling Stone cover it, and not only Billboard and Rolling Stone, but if Billboard and Rolling Stone cover this.
But what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's not like it's not the Beatles. It's not the Beatles getting together. It's the two surviving ex-Beatles getting together for the first time in about 2 years, which is.
But the reason why it's getting all this coverage is for that very same reason, because it's the two Beatles together. It's the two that we have left. And there are a lot of people out there who cling on to their memories of the Beatles and think very highly. Hey, look, go back to the year 2010 when Ringo played at Radio City Music Hall for his 70th birthday. He had a great band, as he always does in the All-Stars. All you heard about that night was that Paul McCartney was there.
That was different.
That
was different. Exactly. He was playing the two of them together on stage live, playing Birthday and actual. And
it was also a surprise too.
Yeah,
that was
right.
So
yeah. Plus, I was there, so it made it.
And I was
automatically important.
There you go, guys. There you go.
But that will get more attention than anything else, because it's the two of them, and that's the way the media handle it, because they're both part of the greatest band ever. Whether you like it or not, that's how the media handles it.
It's news. As you said, and as my editor at Billboard said, it's news.
It's stupid.
No, it's not.
Well, that's because we in the media are the enemy of the people, and we like to
that's
these things.
There you go, Alan. Yes, you're correct. We are.
So on to other news.
Yeah, let's move on. We've lost actually two people that have Beatle connections, one more than the other. The first one would be the artist Alan Aldridge, who anyone with the book, the Beatles Illustrated Lyrics, knows of his work. But he also did work. He did the artwork for the Elton John Captain Fantastic. He did It's Only Rock and Roll for the Stones. He's done. He's put out all sorts of artwork, and he did some great. Those great psychedelic artwork way back when, and it was really sad to hear about that. Anybody have a comment about that?
Great artist. In fact, I remember a few years ago I gave away, and you mentioned it in your article, Steve, something that came out called a Beatles Illustrated Collective Set, which was an 18-month calendar with his artwork. And accompanying that was a vinyl, I guess 45.
Was it a vinyl or was it a CD? Because I have mine and I haven't opened it.
I have a vinyl one, and it's all covers of Paul McCartney songs. So I was giving that away on my website.
The one I have is has McCartney and Beatles. So
Yeah.
maybe it's a CD version, but
Right. It's
I think the
combined.
one classic image of his that you see a lot is the Beatles as old men.
Yeah.
That's it's like if you kind of, especially now, you look at it and you think I sort of wish it had turned out so that we could see that picture live. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's a good point, Al.
But it was a good projection,
Yeah. And then the third piece of news that just broke today, in fact, I guess within the past couple of hours, is guitarist Larry Coryell has passed away, which he did some Beatle covers. He was on Guitar Tribute to the Beatles, Volume 1, doing something, and there's a version on YouTube if you search of him doing She's Leaving Home. Mm-hmm. And I have not heard that album for a long time, but it was a very diverse album, and there was some really good stuff on there. I do remember that there was actually two volumes they put out separately. But Alan, you were saying that you met him.
I did a radio interview once where he was a guest, and it was a bunch of guitarists in different genres. The other one who was there, I remember, was Sharon Isbin, classical guitarist. I think possibly Carlos Barbosa Lima too. And in this show, we talked to all of them, and they all played together. Larry Coryell was he was an incredible guitarist. He was professionally a jazz guitarist, but he studied classical guitar, and he did this kind of jazz rock fusion thing that is sort of in the same sort of school of thought as someone like John McLaughlin. And he was just a great player. The Beatles connection is a little peripheral because he did some covers and that was it. I'm not sure if we talked about the Beatles when I talked to him. This was in probably the 80s, so long ago. But yet another musician loss this week, so it's a pity.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get to the main part of the show. We have a special guest today, Mr. Piers I'm going to do that again.
Hemmingsen.
Thank you. I'm trying to read my writing too. That's not a good thing. Piers, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You have, and as we said, you have a book called The Beatles in Canada, which pretty much says what it's about. And the way Canada found the Beatles was a little similar to what happened with America, but Canada had there were some different reasons why the Beatles got picked up in Canada. What were they?
I'll just go back to one thing about the book. The book came out last year. I call it the Red Book because it covers up until September of 1964. The follow-up, the Blue Book, which I'm working on now, will take it right to the end, 1970. But to answer your question, the Canadian Beatles story is different from the American Beatles story at the beginning, but it is very similar all the way through. There are obviously some differences, but it's a similar story. And the main differences, I think, have to do with the political ties that Canada had with the United Kingdom in the 1950s into the early 1960s. There was a lot of people traffic, usually one way. People emigrated from the United Kingdom. They wanted to get away from rationing in the late 50s. It was a pretty miserable existence compared to North America. So Canada was one place where they took a lot of, I guess, people emigrating from the United Kingdom. The people who were there typically had choices. They could choose between Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and they would generally have to apply and go through a lot of paperwork. And eventually, once their paperwork was approved, they would take a one-way ship to, in this case, Canada. So there was a lot of one-way people traffic. Capitol Records always the Beatles label in North America was headquartered in Los Angeles. In the 50s, it was purchased by EMI circa 1955. And I think that was a very significant event because Capital of Canada would have access to some recordings out of their parents' parent, if you will, in England, that was more suitable for release in Canada than it would have been in the United States due to the demographics, i.e., there were a lot of expatriate English people living in Canada who wanted to buy records by British artists like Freddie Gardner, the saxophonist from the United Kingdom who had some wartime hits. They wouldn't have sold one of those records in the States. I believe his stuff was issued there on Columbia and the odd one on Decca, but they didn't do much. But up here, they did very well in numbers. It's all relative, of course. But to answer your question, I think that really made the difference as to why the Beatles took off in Canada in 1963 instead of February of 1964, with the Ed Sullivan Show. In the States, I was watching that show, of course, and it was an amazing show. I'd seen the Beatles on television when I lived in England the year before, when they had Please Please Me on the charts. Canada did not have any televised Beatles segments during 1963, but we had news segments. So they did make the news, the radio. The records were played on the radio. She Loves You charted at #1 in late 1963. And Canada, the Capital subsidiary, had the first album in North America, which was obviously the second British album with the Beatles. They just added the word Beatlemania to the front of it. But, singles, albums, circa December 1963 were the hottest thing in Canada.
Mm-hmm. You also got the Ringo version of "Love Me Do" that nobody else got, that America didn't get.
Well, that's an amazing thing. And when I did the research for the book, I kind of concluded that the original master tape that was lost probably ended up in Canada. And at the end of the book, I do have the circle closing where I bring back the Canadian version back to Abbey Road, and one of the engineers there, his name was Sean. He took that master for posterity and made a new one out of it. But it was definitely the Ringo version on drums that was issued in Canada. I have to be honest, when I looked at sales figures from February of 1963, you're talking about 200 copies of that record selling across 3,000 miles. So it wasn't a large seller.
Was that when you say you brought it to Abbey Road, was that did that end up on the Beatles Rarity album? Is that where that ended up, or was that after that?
Probably after, right? Because on the Rarities album, on the notes, they say that they actually took it from a vinyl single.
Right.
So when did you give the tape to them, Piers?
Just a few years. I think it was 2014 or 2014.
Okay.
20-odd years after the Rare record. But, it's all different. Canada had a fan club set up here in the fall of 1963. Canada's fan club would become the largest organized fan club outside of the United Kingdom. They had upwards of 100,000 members in the Toronto chapter at one stage. And when the Beatles came to do the Sullivan Show, there was no organized U.S. fan club. They brought the two girls down from Toronto to hang out with the Beatles at the Plaza Hotel. Des O'Hoffman was the photographer with the entourage. He took their pictures sorting mail at the Plaza with George and with Paul. I think you might have seen some of those pictures. But Canada obviously had a minor role relative to Ed Sullivan, but there's obviously a lot of detail in the book that I've prepared, but I'm just trying to summarize. Canada had kids coming back from the United Kingdom with Beatle records, turning on their friends. But the way the circle went here is that the radio station had to play the Beatles records for kids to hear them before the kids would go out and buy the records. So it took a few radio stations in certain pockets in Canada to play records like She Loves You and From Me to You. before that, before kids would actually go out and buy the record. From Me to You, they got into a battle with Del Shannon. In places like Winnipeg and Vancouver, the radio stations would have this thing called Battle of the Bands, and they would take the same song by two different artists, play them back to back, and then have the phone lines open up and have kids vote as to which one they preferred. In Winnipeg, they preferred the Beatles over Del Shannon. In Vancouver, it was Del Shannon that was the preferred cover. So at the end of the day, it was She Loves You that became the number one song for the Beatles. By the time they stepped onto the stage at Ed Sullivan on February the 9th of 1964, Canada already had two albums out. They had the Beatlemania album, and then they had almost a greatest hits for its time, was called Twist and Shout. So it took up some of the old tracks from Please Please Me, but it basically had all of their first four Canadian 45s right up to She Loves You. So for anybody that didn't sort of cotton on to the Beatles in 1963, they could buy that album and be totally up to date. And I know, from my reading of the Bruce Spicer books and other books in the States, there was a whole bunch of different companies like VJ, and then Swan picked up on She Loves You. The mystery to me in my research was why Capitol in Canada did not issue I Want to Hold Your Hand in December of 1963, and instead they chose to issue the two-sided rollover Beethoven with Please Mr. Postman on the back, when they could have had I Want to Hold Your Hand issued in December of 63. I never could find out why that was, other than I think they just had the master tape for the album, and it was practice back then to take a couple of cuts off the album and put them out as a single to get interest in the record, in the album.
Okay. Alan?
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering if in your research you looked at, you said, for instance, that Love Me Do sold 200, and if you've followed the record sales of the early singles after that, how they spread across the different provinces of Canada. Where were they the strongest, and how did you look at the sales in different areas?
Sure. I've got a whole chapter, and the chapter has the charts from every major radio station across Canada. So I do break it out by city, and you can see which cities charted Beatles records at the beginning and which obviously did not. So Toronto was a big Beatles center. London, Ontario was a big Beatles center. Ottawa, so a lot of Ontario cities. Winnipeg and Vancouver were the other two. Montreal was late, partly because of the bilingual aspect of Quebec. They didn't chart She Loves You. The first number one record in Montreal was Rollover Beethoven, which turned out to be a huge hit in the discos of Montreal, probably due to the beat of the music. But yes, I do go across Canada, and even some of the smallest places, they got review copies of the records. And Grand Prairie in Alberta, CFGP is the radio station. They were one of the first stations to chart Please Please Me in April of 1963. And I show the chart in the book. And largely, I believe that's because they could receive the big Chicago station. I know it's Dick Biondi was the
WLS.
WLS. And I think a lot of these smaller stations would just tune into the big American stations, and whatever they like, they would kind of break into their charts. So I do go back to the beginning of rock and roll, as I mentioned, in Canada. And rock and roll was invented in the United States. Rock and roll came to Canada in the 50s over the airwaves from big radio stations like WKBW in Buffalo and just in Chicago, where after the war they were investing in 50,000 watt transmitter towers when our biggest stations probably had 1,000 watts. So any young teenager with a transistor radio would get loud and clear, Tom Shannon from Buffalo, New York, all over Ontario, but they might not get their own local radio station as strong. And they were playing Beatles stuff. That's what they heard on the radio. So strong American influence for sure.
It's interesting that, there was an American influence, and yet the Beatles, in a way, breaking in Canada earlier, showed that there was also some independence, too,
Yeah, Paul White was the A&R equivalent of Dave Dexter Jr., and Paul was one of those people that emigrated from the UK in the late 50s, and he was British, and he got a job at Capitol Records, and he started releasing records that he felt would appeal to Canadians, as opposed to just issuing records by, Capital LA in Canada, which they did, of course. I mean, Nat King Cole and Peggy Lee and the Kingston Trio were all popular here. But he was also able, with his own series of records, to issue things from England that he thought would have a chance in Canada. So he would issue, George Martin's Ray Cathode 45 Time Beat got an issue on Capitol in Canada. Who bought it? I have no idea. John Barry 7 with the James Bond theme, the Temperance 7, Helen Shapiro, all these people who may have not been picked up by Capitol in Los Angeles. Notably, I guess Frank Ifield wasn't picked. Maybe one of his records before he was passed over to VJ. I'm not sure, but basically, Paul White was issuing everything that was charting in the UK that he thought would work in Canada.
Mm-hmm. So after Love Me Do and its sale of 200, how did the sales increase over the next few singles before February '64?
It's safe to say that Love Me Do and Please Please Me were not big sellers when they were initially issued in Canada. Please Please Me came out just about the same time as, I'm thinking, Please Please Me came out on VJ, correct? In the States? Mm-hmm. And I've checked with Bruce Pizer. The timings are very similar, but between the Love Me Do in Canada and the Please Please Me on VJ. Please Please Me in Canada wasn't issued until the beginning of April. It sold marginally more than Love Me Do, but the record that really got some traction was not until June, was From Me to You with Thank You Girl.
Mm-hmm. Did you run into any records of how and whether the Canadian Beatles things were imported into the U.S. early on? I mean, we hear about people, bringing things over from England, but it seems like it would have been a bit easier to get them from Canada, bring them right down.
I got stories in the book that go the other way around, where people were actually bringing, VJ records up to Canada. I don't know why, but they were gifts, things like that. When the Beatles took off, there were two enterprising individuals, I believe, from it's either Philadelphia or Brooklyn. The details are in the book, but they literally took a direct flight or train to Toronto. They met with Capitol Records, and they did a deal to take three singles that weren't issued in the States: Love Me Do, Roll Over Beethoven, and a third one called All My Loving. And they literally trained carloads of these records to go down to the East Coast. And the numbers we got from a search was, and speaking with Paul White, was something like 350,000 copies of each.
Wow.
And they started to chart on Billboard, and I believe also on Cashbox in I think March of 1964. And they were on the jukeboxes in the States. You could buy them. I have documentary evidence in the book from someone who lived in Brooklyn who saw the records for sale. They were charging, I think, 10 cents more per 45 for a Canadian Capitol Beatles 45. But very quickly, I think Capitol in LA saw this as not a good thing. They put some pressure on the Toronto office to say, hey, what's going on? They denied they knew anything about it. But somebody must have known to get that many records pressed by our sister here and shipped down to places like Chicago, where it was on the charts, and Philadelphia, New York. Somebody had to know something.
Mm-hmm. I remember seeing Roll Over Beethoven in New York early on.
Yeah.
Those were, I wouldn't say plentiful, and we kind of knew that they weren't American. We probably even knew that they were Canadian. We'd heard of the place,
It
was
in the small print around the edge of the label. There was the word Canada, but it looked like a yellow and orange swirl. It looked like a Beatles product.
Mm-hmm. So She Loves You was the first number one. Do you remember what that sold and when it hit number one there?
I have the chart. It hit number one December the 13th, 1963.
Mm-hmm.
A number one record back then, if they did 25,000 copies, probably early December. By the end of the month into January, they were up to probably, I think, 100,000 copies. That was a huge seller in Canada. So the numbers in Canada are nowhere near the numbers you have in the United States. So, for example, the biggest selling single of all time in the 60s was All My Loving in Canada, and that sold over 300,000 copies in Canada. So that's your equivalent, I think, in the States. You were selling something like 7 million copies of the Meet the Beatles album, according to the information. So shows you how small the Canadian market was relative to the United States.
But what was the population in 1963-64?
We were approaching 20 million. And you were well over 200 million. So, it's a factor of 10.
Right. Okay, so on to who wants to pick up, Ken or Al?
I'll pick up because I can kind of segue from what you were saying, Alan. Because when you were mentioning the fact that copies of particularly the Roll Over Beethoven, Please Mr. Postman single had made their way to New York, I think actually even before that happened, this was in February, radio stations, because of the fact that at that point they were, looking to get their hands on any scrap of Beatles music, actually had gotten imported copies of that single and were playing it. And in fact, when the Beatles played the Washington Coliseum, their first actual live concert in the U.S., they opened the show with Roll Over Beethoven.
Aha. Okay. So it was popular.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I since I've published the Red Book, I've actually come up with further information that suggests that Canada tried to get the Beatles, when you talked about Washington, Canada tried to get the Beatles concert for that visit. And obviously the States was the bigger target for the Beatles. And where they talked about it, nothing was ever finalized. Obviously, after the Sullivan Show, everything changed.
Right. But that summer, when they did come back for their first North American tour, they did do 3 shows in Canada.
Yep.
And
Vancouver was on August the 18th.
Right.
August the 22nd of 64.
Right.
And then Toronto was September 7th and Montreal September the 8th. And they had big problems in Vancouver with security. They were using fencing that you would normally use for cattle and livestock, and knocked that over. And the Beatles were lucky to escape by running off the field. And Mal Evans, their roadie, was able to protect the Beatles. But they never went back to Vancouver. They only had one show. They didn't sell out that show. And I think it was just, again, if you had the choice after, when you were planning to come back, you only wanted to go back to the cities where you could get like real traction and security as well to go with it. Toronto had good security. Montreal, unfortunately, there was an English-French thing happening, and the separatist people felt that Ringo was somehow identified with this English problem that they had in Quebec, and there were death threats placed on Ringo.
Really? Wow.
The police had to provide extra security, And the entire time that they were there, they were only there for 10 hours. Ringo was really, really worried about his life. And on the same day, there was a hurricane bearing down on Florida, Jacksonville, their next destination. So they chose to get the heck out of Montreal and head right down to Jacksonville, where I think they had a day or two to rest before their show in Jacksonville. But they never went back to Montreal. They never went back to Vancouver. But Toronto, because of that fan club connection I mentioned, with so many fans, they had 2 concerts in each year, 64, 65, 66. And I believe Maple Leaf Gardens holds the record for the most number of North American Beatles concerts at one venue, which would be 6.
There's a great soundboard recording of that Vancouver show too.
Right.
That's
Well,
been
it's
floating
actually
around on.
it's actually probably the best documented Beatles concert because apart from the concert, you've got all of the backstage stuff with the journalists covering it, and you've got the press conference, and it's really a hoot, you know.
And a little clip of that even made 8 Days a Week.
Mm-hmm.
It did. The gentleman's name was Jack Cullen, and he was very clever. He had a Saturday night show, and he chose to have his show at the Empire Stadium, and he basically allowed the audio to just flood into his show, and that's how that recording came. I actually am very fortunate. I own an acetate of that show. It's been bootlegged, of course, many.
Oh yes. We know that well.
But Vancouver was in the book. I've got a great story about them landing and getting cheeseburgers at a certain drive-in restaurant. And Ringo, as ever, didn't want any onions on his cheeseburger, and they had to make
of course.
And that got into the papers, but.
It got mentioned in the press conference too, I think. With some,
Yeah.
That's the great thing about that bootleg. You hear them interviewing some little kid who saw them at getting the hamburgers, and then later on they turn up for the press conference, and one of the journalists says, "We hear you had 25-cent hamburgers or something," and the Beatles are really like, "What? What the hell is going on here?"
Yeah.
It made the front page. The really sad thing about Vancouver was that our national broadcaster, CBC, invested a lot of money to film the entire concert in color. So the entire show was filmed in beautiful color, and it was all done on brand new equipment. The story's in the book. And at the end of the day, one of the CBC executives wanted to impress his girlfriend and invited her up to the room to watch this concert in color. And they watched this concert in color, but they didn't realize, because it was new equipment, while they were watching it, they were erasing it.
Oh my God.
So
Firing squad.
Yeah.
Really.
Imagine, okay, he probably had a nice time for a couple of hours, but I think he got into trouble after that.
I would say so. Oh my God, what a great story.
Yeah.
Oh God, that's terrible.
I'll bet.
Yeah. So I think there's recently some color footage has surfaced from the Montreal show. I believe it's 10 minutes worth, and that's coming up for auction soon. And I took a look at it. The quality is very good. I am aware of some excellent footage from the Toronto 64 shows, and all of this is coming out. It's wonderful, and I think eventually, with such interest in the recent film 8 Days a Week, I think people are more interested in seeing some of the video they haven't seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Oh, I know that Toronto Audio was auctioned several years ago, and that included all the opening acts, as I recall.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yep. The 66 tape has the Remains. It has the Circle and some other acts of the Ronettes, I guess.
Did you hear it?
Yes.
I actually had excerpts of it on the Abbey Road website way back when, because the auctioneer let me preview it. And it sounded, as I recall, like an audience recording. Is that right, Piers?
Yeah, it's an audience recording. The government of Canada was interested in buying that recording, and I helped them with that. In the end, as you say, it's an audience recording. it's not something that Apple could really market. It's not good enough quality. But a few years ago, I was lucky enough in doing the research for the book to discover a really good recording of the 65 show in Toronto, and it has the opening act, Sounds Incorporated, and Brenda Holloway, and the others, plus the full Beatles show. Apple is interested in doing something with it, but at this time, all they've done is listen to it. They haven't actually made any decision. But I hope that someday, for me, I've heard it, and I'd say the guitar work by George is one of the best that you're going to hear. It's not great quality, but the good news is that it was done off the soundboard, so it wasn't done out in the audience. It would need some work, and again, if you do anything with Apple, it has to be approved, authorized, and all those other good things that they do. They don't want to put out anything that's substandard, but it's good to know it exists.
Well, that's interesting that they're actually taking an interest in concerts. That's something that I think we've talked about before, and that's, I think, is that the first time we've heard they've actually taken an interest in a concert that hasn't been out before? I think it is.
Well, yeah. I don't know. All the things we hear about them thinking about are things that have been around. But this, a soundboard, that's very tantalizing.
Yeah. Maple Leaf Gardens is still up, right?
Yes, it's still up. And we had, last summer, we had a 50th anniversary concert. And a group, a cover band, obviously, played the whole set list. And it was sold out. There's so many Beatles fans up here. And for me, I love it. The City of Toronto did a Beatles museum exhibit last year. They asked me to be a guest curator, and I was just thrilled because I got access to so many archives that I wouldn't normally have had access to. So, television archives, radio archives, newspaper stuff, and photographers, which I really enjoy. And I did a series of walks. So I'm doing them again this year. So I walk anybody that's interested from Maple Leaf Gardens down to the King Edward Hotel, and we tell stories, and it's a lot of fun. And the Beatles stayed at that same hotel for 3 years, same room. And the stuff that the walls could tell if they could talk was amazing. But I'll tell you, just from doing the walks, I get people who come along on the walks who were at these shows, who have stories, and it's just always a learning experience for me. I love it.
I guess it's safe to assume you never went to any of the Beatles concerts, right?
I didn't live in Toronto then, and I wish I had, but I was lucky, as I mentioned at the beginning. I lived in England in '63. I was at school. I saw them on television at the very beginning of what they were doing. I'm pretty sure they never played Love Me Do on television, but I did see them do Please Please Me on the, I think it was Thank Your Lucky Stars.
Right. And you also say in your book that you saw them on Jukebox Jury.
That probably, yep, exactly. I was very fortunate. We moved back here in August of '63. My brother had the album, and believe it or not, he had the Smarts to Buy It in stereo and the singles. So I could listen to every, and I guess I'm lucky in that I listened to everything the way it was released in the UK. Yeah, which not many Canadians can say.
Yeah, really. When's the Blue Book coming out, Piers?
Oh gosh, you can only imagine that the Blue Book covers all this amazing stuff, including the Lennon visits to Toronto.
Right. Wow.
It covers obviously all the releases, the music. I got so much material; it's like a fire hose of material. I can't see myself having it done for another year or two, even though I thought I had a lot of the research done. I've just been blown away by how much stuff there is. So when it's all said and done, the Blue Book and the Red Book will be, a two-volume package, and the book will also have rare recordings on it as an audio disc, and maybe even some video this time. I don't know. I don't think any of you has listened to the CD yet, but there was a Canadian DJ who worked for Radio Luxembourg in the 50s, David Gell, and I was so fortunate I tracked him down, and David now lives here in Calgary, and he kindly recorded an introduction to the audio CD. And David, you'd never heard of him, but he was a DJ at Radio Luxembourg. He was the first guy to play an Elvis Presley record in Europe. And when John Lennon met him, he basically bowed down to his feet and said, "You were the guy that got me into rock and roll. And here's this man who's now well into his mid to late 80s out in Calgary, Alberta. Just a very kind man and part of the little Canadian story."
What else is on the CD?
The CD has some of the 65 concert that I mentioned. It's got the warm-up. It's got a lot of Tony Barrow from the press conference that's never been released before. There are interviews with the fan club, girl, Trudy Metcalf, who started the first Canadian fan club. Some of her stories. There are all of the original 1963 radio news reports about the Beatles.
Oh, wow.
From the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So anything I could find, basically, that would, and then I had to jam it into a 1-hour disc. But there are 37 tracks, and all pretty historic stuff. And I was able to find an air check of a Chum Toronto, where they were playing a brand new record, which was I Want to Hold Your Hand, but they weren't playing the A side. They preferred the B side in Toronto. They were playing I Saw Her Standing There. So it's kind of funny how Canadians interpreted, an A side to a B side in 1964. It was very, very little bit different from what you had in the States.
So even in Canada, then, I Saw Her Standing There was the B side of I Want to Hold Your Hand, as opposed to This Boy, which was the B side in England.
Yes. Yep. There was a big mandate that came down from Alan Livingston in Los Angeles to the executives in Toronto said, okay, from here on in, you're not issuing your own Beatles stuff anymore. You're going to do it our way. And that was fair from, sending masters around and things like that. So after the first 3 Canadian albums, in fact, our third album was called Long Tall Sally, has a cover that looks just like your second album, but we couldn't call it the second album because it wasn't the second album. It was
right.
The third. So I think ideally, if they called it the Beatles' third album and it had the same cover as the one called the second album, that would have really messed things up. But they chose to issue tracks that weren't necessarily available yet in Canada, but because Canada already issued everything, there was only basically 2 new tracks on the album.
Right.
One was Misery and I guess Long Tall Sally from the EP. So it didn't sell so well, typically because the second album in the States was being imported in the thousands into Canada because it was a new Beatle record and it was released before Long Tall Sally. So by the time Long Tall Sally came out, there was nothing new there really, and it didn't do so well. And after that, Capitol in Los Angeles said, from here on in, it's going to be our catalog, and that's what you're going to issue. So starting with something new, everything was the same pretty much, right up and until Let It Be.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
Can you talk a little bit more about Paul White and his importance in this whole story? Because it really is remarkable when you think about it. He had such belief in the Beatles early on. And he was pushing all the singles and even sending out tip sheets to radio stations advising them to listen to this band. And also, why do you think that in Canada they were so slow to pick up on the Beatles, just like here in America?
Well, I believe it's for one reason. Nobody could see the Beatles in 1963 on television in Canada, and very few kids had access to the magazines like Melody Maker or New Musical Express. They were sold here, but they were sold at newspaper stands, but they always lagged by a few weeks or maybe even a month. So there were a few hip kids that would pick up these magazines. Generally, they were kids who were playing in guitar-based bands that were interested in what was happening in England. Cliff Richard was a big seller here in Canada, didn't do so much in the States. So there was a general interest in what was happening because a lot of people had family in the UK, of what was happening in the pop charts of the NME and the Melody Makers. So I think that had a lot to do with, the early birds. They couldn't see, the hair. Once they saw the hair, and once the news stories that I mentioned that are on the CD, once the news started picking up on these four guys with this really long hair, kids thought, well, it's kind of a form of rebellion. And it's funny, I have a whole chapter in the book on merchandise that was sold in Canada around the Beatles. And the very first item that was for sale up here was a Beatle wig. And there were kids as early as November 1963 wearing these imported Beatles wigs from England.
Wow.
The week before Ed Sullivan, they were selling for $29.95, which was a crazy expensive amount of money. And within 2 weeks after Ed Sullivan, they were down to about $2.99. So it's supply and demand. There's some really good stories in the book about the merchandising and what products were sold in the States versus what was sold in Canada. So some of the people I've talked to down in the States who specialize in Beatles memorabilia always kind of email me or contact me because they'll come up with something that looks identical to what you have in the U.S., but it says on it somewhere made in Canada. And we always try to figure out, how soon did we get it? Did we have it first? Did they have it first down there? There's combs, there's all of that stuff that was sold up here. Wallpaper was shipped from England to Montreal in February of '63. I think an entire shipload of wallpaper, and that ended up everywhere, the Beatles wallpaper. So I have a chapter on that, all of the promotional stuff that Capitol Records of Canada put together to promote the records. But I want to answer your question about Paul White. Paul White was operating on his own. He had two hats. He was an A&R guy who had to listen to the new stuff. He was also head of promotion. So usually in the States, they would have one person looking after A&R and another department looking after promotion. But Paul did both. So to your point about him sending out the tip sheets, he called it a sizzle sheet. He would publish that every Friday. He would put on his comments about what he recommended a radio station should plug from Capitol. So back then, radio stations would be getting free records from Capitol. They'd be getting free records from Columbia, et cetera, and they felt duty-bound to plug a couple of their records every week because they were getting them for free. If they didn't plug them, they weren't likely to get any more free records. So Paul was very good at writing comments in his sizzle sheet. Those sizzle sheets went out to about 200 radio stations, and his background was journalism. So he had worked in England for a couple of newspapers, so he was very good with his writing skills, and he had like a sense of humor, so an English sense of humor. So I think he was able to combine some nice marketing and music commentary to his sizzle sheets, and people like getting those. It was a free thing they got from Capitol Records.
Mm. But you're saying you think that because the Beatles were in the news, once Canadians saw them on television, that was one of the biggest reasons why they caught on, more so than the record promotion.
I think it was the fan club doing a lot of work to get the Beatles word out there, and Chum was the largest station in Toronto. They ended up bankrolling the Beatles fan club, and in just before Christmas of '63, they had Trudy Metcalf on the radio for a whole hour and playing cuts from, the Beatles album, Beatlemania, as well as some of the other records that were available. And she was talking about them coming to Ed Sullivan then. So she was telling, kids on the radio, okay, the Beatles are coming to Sullivan on February the 9th, and this is on like December the 23rd. So Canadian kids had a lot of information via Chum, and Chum was strong on promoting the fan club because they thought the Beatles were going to be big, and it was Chum that actually paid for their airline tickets to New York. It was Brian Somerville, who worked for Brian Epstein, who brought the girls down to New York to thank them for all the work that they did to get. And when John Lennon met Trudy Metcalf, again, he got down on his knees and he said, I want to thank you for all that you did to get us going here, but obviously not in the States. Montreal had a fan club. Unfortunately, the girl who started that fan club was kind of eclipsed by the Toronto fan club to a degree, in that she didn't get invited down to New York. It was the girl from Toronto. So the fan club had a lot to do with it. The radio station had a lot to do with it. I wouldn't say magazines so much, but we had one writer up here named Sandy Gardner, who wrote for the Ottawa Journal, and he was plugging Beatles records right from Love Me Do. So the first written review of a Beatles record I tracked down was March 3rd or March 4th of 1963. He reviewed Love Me Do for the Ottawa Journal in their weekly pop column, and he would go on and he would kept hyping and hyping and hyping the Beatles, and he would offer 25 copies of the next Beatles single for a contest. And Sandy got his if you know the first Canadian album, there are 4 sort of tabloid style quotes on the front cover.
Yes.
Okay, so Sandy got his reward. They put his quote at the top. Sandy Gardner talked about how it was a disease infecting kids across Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, so there was a couple of journalists that were plugging the Beatles. Again, I think seeing the cover of Beatlemania, seeing that album, obviously sparked a lot of interest in kids because finally they could see what they looked like visually with the hair. And the hair, 4 kids with long hair, nobody else looked like that at that time. So I think it was a rebellion. It was a new thing. And all around Canada in December of 63, I know a lot of kids got that album as a gift in December of 63. It was just something that was hotter than hot. RCA Victor was pressing Elvis's Fun in Acapulco in the final week of November of 63. The very weekend that Kennedy was assassinated, the 22nd, 23rd, 24th of November, RCA Victor was in overdrive pressing copies of Beatlemania. They had initially, I believe, 25, and then it was amped up to 50,000 copies of that album pressed for the Christmas market.
Yeah, I think I may have told you this story, Piers, but sometime in '64, I walked into a record store in Hackensack, New Jersey. Second week in a row of gotten Hackensack in, and saw a copy of this album called Beatlemania with the Beatles, with the famous Robert Freeman photograph on the cover, but it wasn't Meet the Beatles, and then when I looked at it, it was, I realized that it was, this is before I had gotten the Beatles' the American Beatles' second album, and so I realized that it was, it was different from what we had here, and so I got it and brought it home, and it also sounded very different from even from both Meet the Beatles and the Beatles' second album, because there wasn't all of the reverb added to it and all. It sounded more natural. Well,
there's a couple of things to pick up on there. That album has 7 tracks on each side, just like a regular British release of that at the time. Paul White arranged to have the master tape flown over on, I think it was a Monday, it was the week before Kennedy was assassinated. He decided to go with the full release of an album, which was pretty gutsy for him, considering, She Loves You hadn't quite taken off yet, but he was doing it based on what he read in the British press about Beatlemania, and I tie it back to the CBC radio reports that were on the radio every other day here about Beatlemania in October and November of '63. So he heard about it, and he was getting a lot of pressure from kids, the fan club, to put the album out. And the only difference, as I mentioned before, they splashed the word Beatlemania on the top, right, and they added the tabloid quotes. RCA Victor had a very good reputation for pressing vinyl records. They'd opened their plant in 1953, just in front of the Elvis Presley phenomenon. So they had their plant running like a Swiss watch, and they were able to take the outsourcing business of Capitol Records of Canada, because Capitol didn't press their own records up here. They relied on an agreement with RCA Victor, and their quality was very high, and they also had a very good reputation for being able to get records shipped anywhere in Canada within, I think, 36 to 48 hours, from manufacture. So they were dealing with a big space across Canada, and they were able to manage it just in front of that Christmas, big demand back for records. Yeah, the rush.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It actually went head to head with Elvis's Fun in Acapulco for the market. So you had RCA getting paid to do both, whatever rate they were getting to press records. Visually, if you put the two records side by side, one looks older and one looks brand new, exciting.
Yeah.
The one thing, in all your comments, Piers, is how far ahead Canada was in America with the Beatles. It's incredible. I mean, that they were that far ahead.
I also get into something you might be interested in, that George Harrison had family here in Canada.
Oh, right.
And, his sister, Louise, who I know some of you met through the fest and things like that.
Yep.
She and her husband emigrated to Canada in 1956. He was a mining engineer. They lived in northern Ontario, a place called Virginia Town. George would write her postcards starting literally in the summer of '56. He'd write her things like, Louise, I'm learning to play the guitar. A couple of months later, Louise, I've joined a band called the Quarrymen. Months later, Louise, I'm going to Germany, that type of thing. And Louise's mother, obviously George's mother, came out to visit, and George asked his mother when she was out here to get him a pair of cowboy boots, which she brought back to him, and then he wore in Hamburg. And the other three Beatles saw those boots and said, we got to have those. So they had them made in Hamburg. But there was a nice little family connection in that George also had an aunt and uncle in Toronto. Edmund French was his name, Uncle Edmund, Aunt Mimi, his wife. They had two kids. And when George came to play in Toronto, of course, all the family came to visit him at the hotel. So George had family, and believe it or not, John Lennon's girlfriend, Cynthia, her mother didn't really approve of John Lennon for a number of reasons, and came over to Toronto in 1961 to work as a nanny, and she would be based here until 1963, when, of course, John was a world-famous Beatle. She would move back to Liverpool. And so they had Canadian connections. Funnily enough, when the two girls went to New York, they tried to get into, the fan club girls tried to get into the Ed Sullivan Show. They were outside, and they were chatting with this woman from England named Cynthia. And it turned out that Cynthia couldn't get into the Ed Sullivan Show because nobody believed that John Lennon.
Wow.
A wonderful conversation, which is documented in the book, lasted like half an hour. And Cynthia knew all about Toronto because of her mother being there for the previous 2 years. So it's kind of a little side story. George had said in one of his postcards that he would have wanted to emigrate to Canada. And, of course, there wouldn't have been any Beatles if that had happened. I don't think so. But
right.
history there. So again, I think that really reflects the Canadian people traffic between England and Canada at the time. There was a lot of people getting jobs in Canada in the mining industry or the other industries that were here.
You're going to be at the fest in New Jersey.
All excited.
And but people who aren't going to be there that are interested in your book, how can they get it?
Well, if you go to the website, it's thebeatlesincanada.com. The only books that are left are out of the UK, and the link that's on the website will direct you to a page, and the shipping is currently free. So when you get the free shipping, the price of the book is the same. In fact, it's probably a little cheaper now because of the exchange rate. You can order it. I know the people that I've talked to lately that have ordered it, who are based in the States, have ordered it from the UK. They get the book within maybe 7 or 8 days, and they don't pay for the delivery.
Okay.
Nice.
Okay.
But I will have some books at the fest. I've only got 6 hardcover books left. These are all signed by Paul White and Mark Lewison and myself, and they're the last of the 200 hardcover books I did. And I'm going to have those at the table, plus a number of softcover books that were left over from the Chicago Fest from last August.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Piers. This has been great. I've really enjoyed hearing all the stuff some of the stuff is just amazing.
Like I said at the beginning, Canada's Beatles story is different, but it is so similar. So same record company, Capitol Records, the same, Ed Sullivan having the same impact on Canadians, because the Ed Sullivan Show was broadcast on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. A lot of it's similar. And obviously between 63 and 64, the girls went wild over the Beatles. And then later on, it was the guys that got into the music. So, they're very similar. Demographics are similar. Language is similar. Similar story, but different.
Well, thank you very much, Piers. This has been very, very enlightening. Very enlightening.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity.
We'd love to hear from you out there, what you thought of this show or our other shows, and you can write to us at thingswesaidtoday@gmail.com. You can also contact us on Facebook at Things We Said Today Beatles Radio Fans. You can contact each of us on our personal pages. My email is BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I'm going to run around the table. Piers, first of all, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, it's the BeatlesInCanada.com website, and my email address is on the website. So send me an email. I'd be happy to respond to anyone who's interested in the book. And again, I also mentioned the Blue Book is in the works, and I'm happy to solicit any stories or things that people think I should include. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. Let's go around the table. Ken, how do people get a hold of you?
My email address is everylittlething@att.net. You can always visit my website, which is kenmichaelsradio.com. Very quickly, I just want to plug 2 things. My latest syndicated show, For Every Little Thing, is an all George Harrison special for his birthday. And right now I have 24 stations carrying the show. If you want to know where you can hear it, you can go to my Every Little Thing page on the website at kenmichaelsradio.com. I also want to say that I just recently was a guest on a Paul McCartney podcast, which is called Two Legs. It's a brand new show, and it's hosted by Tom Hunyadi and David Gargolino, who are fans of both this show and Every Little Thing. They listen to this show all the time. And so we talk about the first part of Paul McCartney's solo career, the singles that came out from 1971 through 74. And we talk about my history in radio with Every Little Thing. And we talk a bit about this show, too. So if you want to listen to that program, it's going to be posted, they're saying hopefully this Friday, which is February 24th. And it's on podbean.com, just like we are. So if you go to podbean.com and you type in Paul McCartney, you'll see their show there. Again, it's called Two Legs. Okay?
Okay. Cool. Thank you, Ken. Al?
Contact-wise, it's easy. Facebook, Al Sussman. On Twitter, at ASUSS49, or through www.beatlefan.com. And I'll put in two very quick plugs myself, because last week I did an interview, or Steve Ludwig did an interview with me, which actually ran earlier on this evening that we're recording this, but it will be available on Steve's Planet Ludwig archive later on this week. And also this past Friday, Alan Haber and I did another one of our sessions of what Alan calls two Al's Talk Tunes. And actually we'll be doing another one later this week, and I believe that'll be both of those will be running very soon on Alan Haber's Pure Pop Radio.
Okay.
Very good.
Alan?
Okay, you can reach me on Facebook at Alan Cozen or Alan Cozen Remixed. I also read the emails that come in on the Things We Said Today radio show Gmail account, and thanks to in the last week we've actually had quite a few, particularly about the Denny Sywell show. So thanks for your comments about that.
Yes.
And otherwise, I have nothing to plug particularly, having already mentioned my books earlier in the show.
Oh, okay. I didn't mention my book, Meet a Monkey, Davy Jones. It's on Amazon and elsewhere. Very cheap ebook. I guess that's about it, guys. I think we've hit the end of another great week. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for liking us. Thank you for everything. Thank you for being there. This is Steve Marinucci speaking for Alan Cozen, Ken Michaels, Al Sussman, and Piers Hemmingsen, saying thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.